Last week we received update 1.12.3, which was essentially Miyazaki's attempt to dunk on everyone's overpowered builds, and more specifically ruin these two videos on my channel. Thanks Miyazaki, but luckily for us, Miyazaki did not nerf absolutely everything, and there are still some incredibly broken builds that we can use from the DLC, and of course today we're going to be going through one of the most broken of them all, which revolves around the Impenetrable Thorns. So without wasting any more time, let me just show you how to create this stupidly overpowered build. Now for those of you that have been playing the DLC since its release, this probably isn't the first time that you're hearing of the name the Impenetrable Thorns, and that is of course for good reason. It is a brand new spell in the game that does immediate bleed proc with the right build around it, but not only will you be proccing bleed every time you use this thing, you will also be doing thousands and thousands of damage. But just before I show you all of the stats and the talismans, there are a few pieces of equipment that we need to make this build work, because of course other than getting the Impenetrable Thorn spell itself, we do also need to get ourselves the Maternal staff and also the Staff of the Guilty. So I'm just going to quickly show you how you get all three of these items, and I'll start off with the spell itself. So to get the Impenetrable Thorn spell, all you simply need to do is come to the Storehouse 7th floor Site of Grace, which you will obtain as you go through Shadow Keep, and from that Site of Grace, if you head down the stairs and to this area where you can activate the lever, the sort of like hanging structure in the middle of the room will rotate, and you'll be able to access this new little jumping puzzle that you can go through. But as soon as you've done this jumping puzzle, when you head out to this ledge, you will need to drop down to the ledge below where the bat is hanging out. And then if you look just behind the bat, there will be a body with the spell residing on it, and all you simply need to do is obviously go there and pick it up, and the spell is yours. But as I mentioned earlier, there are two specific styles that I recommend you use with this build, and one of them is going to be the brand new Maternal staff that you get in the DLC, and that is because it has an insane scaling with both intelligence and arcane, which is of course imperative for this build. This is going to be the main staff that we're going to use because it will give us the best bleed proc and just the best overall damage output with its insane scalings in both intelligence and arcane. And in order to get the Maternal staff, you do need to find your way to the Cathedral of Magnus Meteor, because this staff is tied to Ymir's questline, which is the main person in the cathedral, and you do need to complete his quest all the way through. I'm not going to spoil anything, but essentially when you get far enough into his quest where he disappears, you can interact with the chair that he is sitting on multiple times. There may be a point in it where you think you're completely done, but you are only completely done when you get this staff. So if you haven't got the staff yet, you still need to examine this chair another time, and upon completing the quest in its fullest, like I say, you will get this staff as well as a load of other items, but of course the staff is the reason why we're doing this quest. But that's not the only staff that we're going to be holding in our hands, because in our offhand I do recommend that you have the Staff of Guilty. The main reason why you want this particular staff is because it boosts thorn damage or thorn spells damage whenever you have that staff wielded. You do not have to use this particular staff, but just by having it in your offhand will also give you that buff, and this staff is actually farmed from particular NPCs, more specifically the Fire Maidens that walk around throughout the Lake of Lernia, Volcano Manor, and of course the mountaintops of the Giants, and you can farm this staff from any of those locations. But there are two particular locations that are going to be better for this farming process, and that's going to be both Fort Lade, and more specifically the Terminus Site of Grace, as well as Guardian's Garrison, and more specifically the White Ridge Road Site of Grace, because every time you come to these Sites of Graces, there's going to be about 10 of these enemies around, and the enemies in question are those kind of like little fire witches that are roaming around. Again, it's pretty easy to see the Staff of Guilty in their hands, and it is a 2% drop rate to have that staff drop by any of these enemies. So just make sure that you come here with all of your item discovery boosts like the Silver Scarab Talisman, Silver Pickled Foul-Foot, and even things like the Silver Tear Mask, and you should be able to get this staff in a matter of minutes. And then once you've got these three items and upgraded the Maternal staff to its maximum, you will then have a staff that has an A scaling in both intelligence and arcane, which is of course incredible for this particular build because the Impenetrable Thorns deal bleed damage. So having a really high arcane will mean that you proc bleed every single time you use this spell, but it also does get a good boost from intelligence scaling as well, which will allow the spell just to deal thousands of damage even if enemies don't bleed. Of course, you're going to be seeing gameplay in the background of me using it in the base game. Again, I don't want to spoil anything for the DLC for those of you that haven't played it yet, but I can just tell you, as you're seeing with me wrecking everything in the base game, the situation is pretty similar in the DLC, where boss fights pretty much only last about 5 or 10 seconds. And this build is pretty much just a plug and play build. Like, you don't need any additional extras. The only thing that you do need to focus on is being relatively close to your enemies, because just to quickly explain how the spell works, when you use the spell, you will sort of like distribute 3 lanes of these Impenetrable Thorns, which typically go to track out your enemies. So if you're close enough to said enemy, all 3 of those pillars will hit the enemy at the same time, rather than say splitting off and only one of them hitting them. So the idea is to get somewhat up close and personal, so you can get all 3 of those pillars to hit your enemy, but this can also be used at range, and of course it is extremely brilliant against the bigger enemies with a much larger hitbox, because again, with those larger enemies, it's almost guaranteed that all 3 of the pillars will eventually hit. But of course, if you want to mimic the damage that you're seeing in the background, here are the stats for our character, and again, as always with all the builds on the channel, it's a level 150 character, and as you can see, we've got 50 points into Vigor, 19 Mind, 20 Endurance, 12 Strength, 15 Dexterity, 21 Intelligence, 33 Faith, and then 59 Arcane. The starting class with this build was a Samurai, so this is not optimized, of course, if you're trying to min-max, as I started with very minimal Arcane on this character, but even still, these stats are more than enough, as you're seeing with the gameplay in the background, and essentially Arcane is going to be the main stat that we want to delve in, because as I mentioned many times now, not only does the staff that we're using to cast the spells have an A-rated scaling in Arcane, but the spell itself also causes bleed build-up, and by pumping our Arcane as much as possible, we're going to be getting the best sort of like AR, if you will, out of the spell, as well as pumping its bleed build-up to the absolute highest. The 33 Faith in the build is also there to allow us to use Golden Vow and also the Howl of Shibiri to buff our damage even further, and the 21 Intelligence is the minimum requirement for the Staff of Maternity, but of course if you're in a much higher level, or say one like a level 200 version of this build, I would just highly suggest pumping Arcane all the way up to 80 before then making your Vigor around 60-65 and then pumping the rest of the stats you have left into Intelligence. But I'll be completely honest, a level 150 build is more than enough to not only destroy the base game but also destroy everything in the DLC as well, and that is of course helped out by these following talismans. So again, where it's bleed focused, we are of course running the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, as we'll get an extra damage boost of 20% whenever a bleed proc does occur, which is literally after the very first use of this spell. But then I'm also running the Aged One's Exaltation, because again, where we're using the Howl of Shibiri, we might as well inflict madness to ourselves to give another 20% boost to our overall damage output whenever that does occur, before then using the Graven Mass Talisman to boost our damage with the spell itself by a further 8%, and then finishing it off with the Radagon's Icon, which of course is extremely handy, especially if we're going to be a lot closer to our enemies, because it would be ideal to get the spell off as quickly as possible, so then we can either dodge the next attack or just move away from the enemy to ensure that we're in that sort of like sweet spot of a distance to make sure that all 3 of those pillars hit that enemy. But of course, that's not everything for the buffs in this build, because we still got the Wonder Physick, and inside the Wonder Physick I highly recommend that you run both the Magic Shroud and Crack tier along with the Intelligence Not tier to again just boost your overall damage output with this particular spell, so then that way you don't necessarily have to rely on the bleed proc if you are up against enemies that are resistant to bleed, because I should hopefully also be showing gameplay of me fighting Radagon and the Elden Beast in the background. We were still doing comfortably around about 2000 if not more damage every time we use the spell, and after about 5 or 6 uses you will actually break the poise of Radagon and the Elden Beast, and the same goes for the DLC bosses as well. So even in, like I say, a worst case scenario where the boss is heavily resistant to this spell for whatever reason, you're still going to be doing at least 1500 to 2000 damage, as well as doing a decent amount of poise damage, and if things get really too hot for you, you can obviously back up and use the spell at range, which of course just allows you to have all kinds of versatility just simply using one particular spell. And then just lastly to mention, of course you can also run the White Mask as part of your armor set, Realistically, the other pieces of the armor don't matter too much, but I would heavily advise that your other armor pieces give a good amount of defense, because obviously where we are up close and personal, you might end up trading a few hits to get your Impenetrable Thorns off, but by running the white mask you will also get an additional 10% to your overall damage output when a bleed proc occurs. So that is kind of imperative, but the rest of the armor you can change up for yourselves. But essentially, with all of that combined, that is how you're going to absolutely break Elden Ring with this fantastic build. Impenetrable Thorns might truly be the most broken thing that exists in Elden Ring to this date, and of course, this is the guide to make the ultimate build around it. And of course, just like that, the video is over, and I hope this has been an enjoyable one for you. I know a lot of us were quite upset that the rolling sparks got nerfed in the way that it did, and unfortunately the lightning perfume bottles aren't quite as broken as they used to be, but luckily, like I said in the intro, this build luckily hasn't been altered in any ways, and it is still an absolute monster. But I want to know from you guys, do you agree? Is this the most broken build in Elden Ring right now? Of course, let me know in the comments down below, and whilst you're down there, if you did happen to enjoy this video, if you wouldn't mind me asking you just to leave a like rating on this video. The reason being is it genuinely does help out the channel tremendously, and it will be the quickest and easiest way to tell me that you enjoy these types of builds and you want to see more of these in the future. And of course, if you're new around here or you find yourself coming back to the channel and you're not subscribed right now, make sure you change that by hitting the subscribe button down below too. We've just hit 26,000 subscribers in total as of the time of this recording, which means we're getting ever closer to that 30,000 mark. So if you want to help us on our journey to getting to 30,000 subscribers, like I say, hit that subscribe button down below. It's free to do, and in return, you'll be notified whenever we drop another killer Elden Ring build. But other than that, I've pretty much said everything that I need to. Like I say, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Go and have an absolute blast with this build and let me know how you get on if you do happen to use it. But otherwise, that's everything from me, so thank you again so much for watching, and I guess I will catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.